institutions in light of NEP 2020. We have with us Dr. Jeevan Kumar, who will be discussing the topic. I would request Mrs. Jyoti Stephen to introduce the resource person to us.
I deem it my pleasure to invite Dr. D. Jeevan Kumar to this session. Dr. D. Jeevan Kumar has attained superannuation from Bangalore University as Professor of Political Science in 2016. Apart from heading the Department of Political Science at Bangalore University, he has served as Director of the Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Study and Research Center, the Center for Gandhian Studies, and Dean of the Faculty of Arts. His areas of specialization include development politics and administration, Indian government and politics, and Gandhian studies. He was a Fulbright Fellow in the USA in 2003 and a Fellow at the Salzburg Seminar in Austria in 1997. He was invited to deliver guest lectures at the United Nations University, Tokyo in 2007 and 2008, and at the George Mason University, USA in 2011. He has presented papers at international seminars and conferences in the USA, Germany, Belgium, France, Japan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. The books he has edited include The Angry Voter, Uniting in Responsibilities in a Culture of Rights, and Excellence in Administration, Prospects and Perspectives. He is currently Honorary Professor at the Karnataka State Rural Development and Panchayat Raj University, Gadak, Chairperson Civic, Bangalore, and Vice Chairman, Sarvodaya International Trust, Karnataka Chapter, Bangalore. A very warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Over to you, sir, for the session.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm grateful to the organizers, particularly Father Carlos and the principal, Dr. Jerome, for inviting me to participate in what I think is an important webinar. The whole theme of inclusiveness and diversity has always been a matter of concern for us in higher education. And in the context of NEP 2020, it's important for us to go back to these two terms that you do find in the NEP 2020, inclusiveness, diversity, and try to fathom what exactly NEP 2020 has to tell us about the status of higher education in India, with specific reference to inclusiveness, with specific reference to diversity. These two themes have been recurring, have been with us since morning. I made the time to listen to each of the other resource persons and was able to gather the focus that each of the earlier resource persons had to make in the context of NEP and the different dimensions of the NEP and so on and so forth. This is how I have divided my presentation. I noticed that we have to conclude by 3:40. 3 to 3:40 is the time given to me. So within the space of those 40 minutes, I thought there are 4 areas I would like to deal with. in the background of the topic that has been given to me, inclusiveness and diversity in higher education in the light of NEP 2020. I will begin by making a few introductory remarks where I would like to share my thoughts with you on the nature of the problem that we have gathered here to discuss in the course of the webinar. The second part of my framework looks at NEP 2020 and the implications for both inclusiveness as well as diversity. That's the second part of my framework. In the third part of my framework, I would like to take a look at the methodology followed by NEP 2020 for ensuring inclusiveness and diversity. If you go through a particular chapter in NEP 2020 that deals with these areas, there is a certain methodology that they would like to be followed, and in that context they make a few recommendations for governments to follow. They also make a few recommendations for HEIs to follow. And those of you, all of us, of course, are in HEIs, so all of you may be interested in knowing specifically what these recommendations are for HEIs in order to ensure inclusiveness and diversity. And then I come to the concluding part, my last part in my framework, where I attempt a brief analysis and make a few concluding observations on my take on NEP 2020 with specific reference to inclusiveness and diversity. So there are 4 areas I would like to cover, and I think by 3:40, 3:45 I should be able to complete my presentation. What am I trying to say in the introduction? What I'm trying to say is as follows. The term GER keeps appearing in documents on higher education institutions. GER, as all of us know by now, stands for Gross Enrollment Ratio. The GER in India, as compared to other countries, was quite low, especially if you compare India with the developed countries. Our GER was very low, and this has been taken note of by several governments in the 5-year plans, especially the 11th and the 12th 5-year plans. There is a specific reference to the low GER, gross enrollment ratio, in higher education in India, and that this should be raised. So a lot of talk about raising the GER, gross enrollment ratio, we find in documents in the past. But if you look at the most recent documents, for example, AISHE, All India Survey on Higher Education, they're telling us that things have improved considerably. They're saying that by 2018-19, our GER had gone up to 26.3%. I think this was referred to by Dr. Cherian Alexander in the morning when he referred to a particular document. AISHE tells us that GER in India has gone up considerably to about 26-27%, and these are 2018-19 figures. At that point of time, they had said that we should be able to reach the target of 32%. The GER target was established at 32% for 2022. I don't have the latest figures, but I think we should be around, if we're not across the 30s, we should be close to the 30% target as far as the GER is concerned. So do we pride ourselves, or do we say that it's something that we should be proud of, that the GER, which was very low earlier, has gone up to 26, 28, perhaps nearing 30%, which was roughly the target for 2022? Or do we ask deeper questions about the composition in this GER? The gross enrollment ratio puts all communities together and says this is the percentage of people in the country who have access to higher education. So do we look at the overall figures, even if some of you feel 30% is not good enough? Even if you feel so, the fact is that 30% is a considerable increase in the situation which was there in the past. And if the situation has improved considerably, as I said earlier, do we say this is good and perhaps we are on track, perhaps we will catch up with other countries and so on and so forth. But then do we or do we not disaggregate this percentage, whatever the percentage is, 28, 30, 32, whatever it is, GR percentage, or do we break it up into categories and try to ask the question, this 28, 30, 32% of GR, who are those who are able to get access to HEIs? And it's in that context that the webinar, the theme of the webinar, of today's webinar is very important. When we're trying to look at inclusiveness and diversity, is it not important that we also take a look at who are those who are managing to get themselves enrolled into higher education institutions? Now, this is the question that I've tried to look at in the course of my presentation. And therefore, by way of introduction, the first point I'm making here is as follows, that when you break up this 28, 30, 32% GR, you will find that the marginalized sections of the population in India still remains far behind, when we're looking at issues of inclusion, when we're looking at issues of diversity, and more particularly issues of equity. Here I would also place before you the fact that literacy rates, education levels among the marginalized communities have improved greatly. If you make a comparison, post-independence period and look at the turn of the millennium and look at 15, 20 years subsequently. Again, here also, there is a great improvement in the literacy rates, in the education levels among the marginalized communities in India. But then, do we again rest content by saying that literacy rates are going up, education levels are going up, or do we compare the literacy and education levels of marginalized sections with the national average? Where are the other sections of people of their own age group, people of their own, with those basic education qualifications? So when you compare marginalized sections of people with their peers in the advanced communities, you would very clearly notice that they fall far short of the national average. These, I think, are important for us to discuss at webinars like these, when we are very happy with the NEP because it marks a sea change in the earlier education policies and so on. Given the focus of this webinar on inclusiveness and diversity, I think these statistics are telling us a lot of things which we may or may not take the trouble to look into. And therefore, since I've been given the task of looking at inclusiveness and diversity in higher education with specific reference to NEP, I thought it's important that we look, that we read between the lines, that we look beneath the surface and not rest content with national averages, not rest content with gross GR, but take a look at who is represented in the GR and try to find out whether marginalized sections are doing as well as we would like them to do. And therefore, I'm stating at the very beginning that the Indian higher education system is found wanting in terms of the virtues of diversity, representation, inclusion, as well as equity. And I'm using each of these four terms with a great deal of forethought, because each of these terms are rich in terms of content, rich in terms of meaning, and therefore it's important that we take a close look at these virtues, because any higher education ecosystem must be able to boast of these four virtues: diversity, representation, inclusion, equity. Allow me to quote a couple of my favorite scholars here in this context. Bhikkhu Parekh, I'm sure you've heard of Bhikkhu Parekh. He says, every society includes large sections who are disadvantaged and unable to develop their human potential, victims of a long history of exploitation, repression, discrimination, and marginalization. These groups, marginalized groups, have for centuries been denied adequate opportunities for growth and treated as naturally inferior, almost as if they belong to a separate species, quote unquote, bikuparek. And our society is no exception. In fact, societies like ours have very strange phenomena like caste, which simply refuses to go away. And therefore, Bikuparek's statement, I think, is worthy of consideration in this context. Anirudh Krishna says that the ladders that lead talented people from the marginalized communities upwards, there are ladders, and we're conscious of the fact that the state has put up ladders that can lead people from marginalized communities upwards. But what would you say, and this is what Anirudh Krishna is telling us, what would you say when these ladders are deliberately broken in many places? You put up a ladder, but quite a few steps in that ladder are broken, and they are deliberately broken. These breakages, says Anirudh Krishna, are detrimental, not just for the affected individuals and their communities, they limit the achievements of an entire society. That's Anirudh Krishna for you. Take a look at what Achanta Subramanian of Harvard University has to tell us. What is understood as merit in India's education institutions is only another name for the accumulated cultural capital of India's upper caste elites. So we're looking at a very serious problem, my colleagues who are listening to me here. We're looking at a very serious problem, and I'm using these terms with a great deal of responsibility. Accumulated cultural capital of India's upper caste elites still continue to dominate the higher education system. What kind of justice is this? There is this scholar by name Miranda Fricker who tells us that Miranda describes this phenomenon as hermeneutical injustice. When certain sections of society are overlooked, are ignored, and this phenomenon of hermeneutical injustice, says Miranda Fricker, is caused by structural inequalities of power. Hermeneutical injustice is caused by unacknowledged systemic prejudice. So I've quoted 3-4 scholars this afternoon by way of a background to the topic that we are discussing here. We're looking at NEP 2020, and that's exactly what I'm going to do now. But the broad theme of this webinar is something that expects all of us to ponder over the state of inclusiveness, the state of diversity in higher education in our country. So this brings me to the second part of my framework, NEP 2020 and implications for inclusiveness and diversity. All of you by now would have gone through the NEP document. It's not a very big document. It's readable. You can finish reading it in one sitting. And all of you would have looked at part 2 of NEP 2020, which deals with higher education. And in part 2, there's a whole chapter that is titled Equity and Inclusion in Higher Education. That's the section I would draw your particular attention to. Part 2, Higher Education, chapter that deals with equity and inclusion in higher education. Let's take a brief look at what NEP 2020 has to say by way of equity and inclusion in higher education. And then I will undertake a little analysis of NEP 2020 from this perspective. What is the NEP telling us here? It's explicitly stated that the policy envisions ensuring equitable access to quality education to all students. And these words sound so nice. NEP says that we want to ensure equitable access to quality education to all students. And there's a comma after this, with a little emphasis which says, with a special emphasis on SEDGs. This sounds so nice. This says right at the very beginning of the chapter. We, the NEP 2020, is saying that this policy envisions ensuring equitable access to quality education to all students with a special emphasis on SEDGs. Okay, that sounds very nice, as I said, but who are these SEDGs? Socioeconomically disadvantaged groups. That's the expansion NEP 2020 gives us for a new acronym that they brought into the higher education ecosystem, SEDGs, socioeconomically disadvantaged groups. Who figure in the SEDGs? According to NEP 2020, 5 categories of people, 5 categories of students would fit into the SEDG category. Number 1, gender identities, within bracket particularly female and transgender individuals. That's the first category of SEDGs. The NEP 2020 notes that women cut across all underrepresented groups, making up about half of all SEDGs, and that the exclusion and inequity that SEDGs face is magnified for the women in these SEDGs. That's a very valid observation or point that NEP 2020 is making. So the first category of SEDGs, according to NEP 2020, refer to gender identities, but there's a specific reference to female and transgender individuals. In the second category, you have socio-cultural identities. SEDG category 2, socio-cultural identities. And here they bring in scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, OBCs, and minorities. All of them figure under socio-cultural identities. In the third category, NEP 2020 brings in geographical identities, such as students from villages, small towns, and aspirational districts. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of this term, aspirational districts, but it's a new term that has entered the dictionary of development in this country. Aspirational districts, earlier we used to call them backward districts, backward regions, and so on. And that term backward is not a very nice term to keep using. And if you were to live in these backward regions or districts, you would be very unhappy to be labeled as a citizen of a backward district. And therefore the term that is used now is a healthier term. They call it aspirational districts. Okay? So students from villages, small towns, and aspirational districts possess what are called geographical identities, and this is category number 3 in the SEDG list in NEP 2020. In the fourth category, you have disability-based identities, and there are various types of disabilities, as you know. They are brought into category 4. And then there's a fifth category of SEDGs, which is titled as identities based on socio-economic background. And who would possess these identities? They say, here the NEP 2020 includes students from migrant communities, students from low-income households, students from the urban poor. This is important. These 5 categories of SEDGs are important for us to be conscious of, because we're looking at inclusiveness and diversity. So whose inclusiveness are we looking at? What kind of diversity are we looking at in higher education? Unless we are familiar with the language that NEP 2020 uses, we will probably be talking very generally about the identities. So as I just told you, NEP 2020 broadly categorizes 5 types of identities and says these are the people who have to be included in the higher education ecosystem. This is the kind of diversity that every classroom in the country must be able to incorporate. Gender identities, socio-cultural identities, geographical identities, disability-based identities, and identities based on socio-economic background. These 5 identities make up a huge chunk of the population of our country. In fact, NEP 2020 itself says that the SEDGs put together make up 80%, 80% of the population of our country. So we're talking about 80%. All these SEDGs together make up 80% of the people of our country. And this webinar on inclusiveness and diversity obviously is looking at 80%, the problems of 80% of the population of our country. So what is the NEP telling us about how to address the problems of inclusiveness and diversity in higher education institutions for people belonging to the SEDG category? There are several innovations NEP 2020 talks about, and let me quickly highlight the innovations. I would say that the policy deserves some appreciation because it brings into its fold gender identities, including transgender. The very first category, brings in gender identities. So this is to be appreciated because in all those categories, women are perhaps twice oppressed. Who spoke of transgender earlier? They bring in transgender communities into the SEDGs. Okay, and as I said earlier, the NEP 2020 very clearly recognizes the fact that women are found in all underrepresented groups, and they make up about half of all the SEDGs. This, I think, deserves appreciation, our appreciation in NEP 2020. The second, my second point of appreciation of NEP 2020 is the inclusion of geographical identities. Students from villages, students from small towns, students from aspirational districts, they have been brought into the fold of the SEDGs. I think that also deserves appreciation. Another cheer the NEP 2020 deserves, because persons with various forms of disabilities also find a place in NEP 2020. And finally, what about those who have hitherto not found a place in the existing scheme of categorization of marginalized communities? The reference is to children of migrant communities, children of low-income households, children belonging to the urban poor. Earlier, we didn't really have a specific category to put these children into. And therefore, as I pointed out earlier, the SEDG group includes also children of migrant communities, low-income households, and the urban poor. And we must, I think, be happy that the NEP takes note of their predicament also. This brings me to the third section in my presentation, which I've titled Methodology for Ensuring Inclusiveness and Diversity. The NEP 2020 has a particular methodology for ensuring inclusiveness, for ensuring diversity, for all the categories of people they have mentioned. And therefore, it's important that we take a look at the methodology proposed to ensure access, to ensure inclusion, to ensure equity to them. Now, the methodology can be broken up into two categories because the NEP 2020 says these are steps the government should take for the welfare of, for the inclusion of, for the access of SEDGs. So there are government initiatives to be taken, and then there are initiatives to be taken by HEIs. I'll briefly read out the steps that NEP 2020 wishes the government to take. There are about 7 or 8, and I prioritize them. Allotment of adequate funds for the education of SEDGs. Funds, as you know, is a major constraint for governments. At least they keep telling us that we don't have money for essential sectors like education. So NEP 2020 says the government must allot adequate funds for the education of SEDGs. Number 2, governments must ensure that clear GER targets are established for them. gross enrollment targets have to be disaggregated. You must have separate targets only for the SEDGs. That's the second recommendation for the government. Third, make sure that gender balance is maintained during the admission process. Four, set up top quality HEIs in aspirational districts, and in special education zones. Another term that NEP 2020 brings into the dictionary is this term called SEZs, where the E stands for education, special education zones in remote areas. Number 5, establishment of HEIs that can impart instruction in local languages. Number 6, monetary assistance and scholarships to SEDGs studying in both government and in private education institutions. Number 7, arrangement of outreach activities to spread information about the opportunities available in the sphere of higher education. And 8, ensuring that SEDGs become proficient in the use of ICT, information and communication technology. This is a short list of recommendations that you find in NEP 2020 that government should take seriously for ensuring inclusiveness and diversity with specific reference to the SEDGs. The second set of recommendations are for HEIs, for higher education institutions. Recommendation number 1, make the curriculum more inclusive. That's a very important recommendation, making the curriculum more inclusive. Recommendation 2 for HEIs, ensuring the employability of SEDGs. Number 3, ensuring that buildings and facilities are friendly to the differently abled students. 4, devising bridge courses for weak students. 5, providing psychological support and mentoring for weak students. 6, offering sensitization programs for teaching and non-teaching staff as well as students on matters pertaining to gender, disability, and so on and so forth. And the 7th recommendation for HEIs, strictly enforce zero discrimination policies, strictly enforce zero harassment policies, rules, and regulations. This is the methodology that you find in NEP 2020 to deal with the SEDGs, to deal with the problems of inclusiveness and diversity, which is so elusive for the SEDGs, which continue to be so elusive for SEDGs in HEIs. So I've given you a list of some 8 recommendations for the government to take seriously, and again 7 or 8 recommendations for HEIs to take seriously. And with that, I come to the last part of my presentation, which I've titled Analysis and Concluding Observations. A perusal of the above set of recommendations in the important chapter on equity and inclusion in higher education in NEP 2020 raises several questions pertaining to the comprehension of the terms equity, inclusion, diversity, and so on. One is reminded of the fact that one of the overarching objectives of both the 11th five-year plan as well as the 12th five-year plan was, and I'm quoting from these two plans, ensuring equity and inclusion in higher education. So the NEP 2020 is not talking about equity, inclusion, diversity for the first time. It has been bothering us. And both the 11th and 12th five-year plans specifically spoke about how to ensure equity, how to ensure inclusion in higher education. And if you take a look at the 11th and 12th five-year plans, you will find a long list of policy measures to ensure the incorporation of these elusive values. Equity, inclusion, diversity are elusive values, never been within our grasp, into the ecosystem of higher education in the country. I'm repeating this point earlier documents, particularly 11th and 12th five-year plans, had a long list of policy measures to ensure equity and inclusion into the ecosystem of higher education in the country. NEP 2020 is obviously influenced by this methodology and does likewise. What I was very disappointed with was the fact that you just take a look at these plan documents, you take a look at the recommendations, and you repeat those recommendations. I don't find anything new in the NEP 2020 recommendations, whether it's for the government or for HEIs. I don't find anything new. I would say, as somebody said earlier, it's old wine in new bottle. And therefore, I think it is hardly surprising that the recommendations made by NEP 2020 are too pedestrian and too unimaginative to make a meaningful difference to the problem of absence of inclusiveness, absence of diversity in our higher education ecosystem. And I'm saying this very consciously. I don't think NEP 2020 is telling us anything new. Even if they're telling us something new, they're too pedestrian, they're too unimaginative, they're too unoriginal. All of these recommendations and much more have already been tried and tested without much success. And therefore, one cannot but get the impression that the NEP 2020 wishes to address the huge problem of exclusion and marginalization of the ACDGs who make up 80% of the population by its own admission through sheer tokenism. 80% of the population, ACDGs, that's what NEP 2020 is telling us. And how do you wish to address the problem of lack of inclusiveness, lack of diversity in HEIs? And the recommendations, as I said earlier, are hardly the recommendations that one would expect from a document of this particular kind. Now, if I'm unhappy with the document because the recommendations are too pedestrian, nothing new, sheer tokenism, and even more important lacunae in NEP 2020 is the absence of a commitment towards affirmative action for the marginalized sections of the population. There is no reference to affirmative action anywhere in the entire document, either for students or for teachers. Which begs the question, does NEP 2020 wish to bring down the curtains on the policy of affirmative action? Even if it wishes to do so, would this be a wise move? Because the benefits of official policies and programs of affirmative action are well substantiated. And let me quickly give you a list of the benefits of policies and programs of affirmative action. These policies ensure equality by erasing or attempting to erase the effects of systematic subordination. They compensate for historic and systemic discrimination that unfairly penalize members of marginalized communities. These policies of affirmative action redistribute resources, redistribute opportunities. They improve the motivation of marginalized communities to rise above their predicament. They ensure greater diversity, which in turn ensures better performance and more productive efficiency. These policies enable marginalized communities to gain better access to social capital. They foster a more representative, inclusive, and legitimate democratic order. And in the long run, affirmative action policies diminish homogeneity and integration within society. In other words, they promote greater inclusiveness, greater diversity in society. And that is the theme of this very important webinar of the day organized by St. Vincent Pallotti College. An unstated premise of NEP 2020 is that the failure of policies of affirmative action to ensure access, inclusion, equity in higher education warrants a serious rethink on their continuance. This perhaps could explain the deafening silence in NEP 2020 on affirmative action. And therefore, my concluding observations are as follows. Last two observations are as follows. I think what is warranted is a serious analysis coupled with introspection of why and where affirmative action policies are not succeeding, and then taking corrective steps. I made a reference to a scholar who calls this hermeneutical injustice. How long are we going to put up with, or are the ACDGs going to put up with hermeneutical injustice without a policy of affirmative action to be, continuation or serious analysis coupled with action steps to take care of their continuing problems. So from this perspective, I'm very unhappy with NEP 2020. I was given the responsibility of looking specifically at NEP 2020 from the perspective of inclusiveness and diversity. And I've gone through the entire document, NEP 2020, specifically the chapter, the section and the chapter that deal with equity, inclusion and all that. And I'm convinced that NEP 2020 falls short in this endeavor of ensuring true inclusiveness and diversity in HEI. So this has been a rather harsh critique of NEP 2020. There are a lot of good things, and the earlier speakers have pointed this out. But I didn't think it's essential when one is looking at the theme of this conference, inclusiveness and diversity, to be able to only look at what the NEP is trying to do. One needs to look behind. One has to take a couple of steps backward to understand whether NEP 2020 has the wherewithal to bring in true inclusiveness and true diversity into higher education. And from this perspective, my little study tells me that NEP 2020 falls short of those expectations. Thank you very much. I hope I've not exceeded my time.
Thank you, sir, for the informative session. Any questions can be posted on the chat box. Father, there are any questions?
I don't see any questions in the chat box.
Thank you, sir, for sharing such an informative session with us. I would request Mrs. Anna Kumari, Head of the Department of Computer Science, to deliver the vote of thanks.
I go and stay with them always.
Hello. I think ma'am is having some network issues, sir. Thank you, sir, for joining the session with us since morning. It was a great honor to have you with us for the entire day.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you, sir. So we will move on to the valedictory session.
Sure,
I invite Mrs. Surya to preside over the session.
Thank you, ma'am. A very good evening to you all. I take this opportunity to extend a warm welcome to all the dignitaries and the participants to the valedictory session of the National Level Virtual Conference of St. Vincent Pallotti College, Bangalore. Now may I request Reverend Father Carlos Lewis, the Head of the Department of Arts and Humanities, to give a review of the conference.
Where is he? Come on. Father is missing.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, Father, you're audible.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I thank you very much for making your time and participating in this national level virtual conference on inclusiveness and diversity in higher education in the light of NEP 2020. We set the tone right with Dr. B.S. Ponmuri Raj, who delivered the keynote address and spoke to us about inclusiveness and diversity in higher education in the light of NEP 2020. We had 4 technical sessions. The first one was by Dr. Cherian Alexander. He spoke about inclusiveness and diversity in competency building and skill development in pedagogy, wherein he enforced on pedagogy as the main concern as of now to bring about inclusiveness and diversity in our curriculum. Thereafter, expanding curriculum, the second technical session was dealt by Dr. Suma Singh. She spoke about the inclusiveness and diversity in curriculum designing and development. The third session was by Dr. Arul Mani, who spoke to us on the cultural and ethical considerations in NEP 2020. We broke for lunch, and thereafter we had paper presentations. We had around 17 people, 17 paper presenters from different departments. In the computer science, we had 3 paper presenters. Miss Moksha Lakshmi, who spoke on the greater emphasis on technology on education development. Presented 2 was Mrs. Preetha Mahesh, who spoke on NEP and thrust of technology intervention in education. We also have had Mrs. Anna Kumari, who spoke on NEP 2020, curriculum opportunities and challenges in industry. From the Commerce and Management, we had 4 paper presenters, Ms. Arundhati SB, along with her co-author, who presented on digital human resource management and a revolution of accelerating the performance. Presented 2, Ms. Renu Verma, along with Mrs. Harshita Kaushik, corollary of social media and technology post NEP 2020 policy. Mrs. Navita Angelin was the third presenter. She spoke on NEP 2020, bridging gap between academics and industry standards. Presenter 4 was Miss Beena and Mrs. Sri Lakshmi AR, who spoke on interdisciplinary outlook of NEP 2020, a study on the ineffectiveness of HEIs in the implementation process. We, for the first time, had languages who presented their papers. So we had 2 presenters, Mrs. Sunita K. and Mr. Vishwa Kumar, who presented papers in Kannada. We also had Arts and Humanities. We had 7 paper presenters. Ms. Bala Vaishnavi, who presented on barriers in assessing the educational materials as per the new Media Education Policy 2020. Dr. Sanjay Kumar Jha, possibilities and challenges in implementing NEP 2020 for higher education. Father Baiju Thomas, a study on empowering educators to promote inclusive education in the 21st century classroom settings. Dr. Yogeshwari Menda, who spoke on great emphasis of ICT on listening comprehension development, NEP 2020 pedagogical structure 5334, and Mrs. Surya, who spoke on language and cultural inclusivity in NEP 2020, Mrs. Jyoti Stephen, NEP 2020, a pathway to monitor psychological well-being, and Father Carlos Lewis, who spoke on NEP 2020 challenges laid before in the mission of equity. And the final technical session was dealt by Dr. Jeevan Kumar, who spoke on the inclusiveness and diversity in higher education in the light of NEP 2020, which is the main theme of today's conference. I think the deliberations and the discussions that we had during the whole session, a whole conference from morning till afternoon, was an amalgamation of what we have in place and what we need to do as to bring about the NEP and bring it to success. I think it was a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much to all the participants and paper presenters for all your deliberations and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. May I now request Dr. E. Jerome Xavier, the Principal of St. Vincent Pallotti College, to deliver the valedictory address.
Good evening, Professor Jeevan Kumar.
Good evening.
Outstanding academician, and above all, personally having known him as a wonderful human being, to have joined us this afternoon. It's quite fitting that we began the program with the NAC advisor, Dr. Ponmudi Raj, delivering keynote address, and concluding with yet another, as I said, eminent personalities in the field of higher education, known not only in Bangalore city but all over India, Professor Jeevan Kumar. My dear participants, I'm sure you had gained sufficient information, input, and insight into this inclusiveness and diversity. Morning speakers, Dr. Suma as well as Dr. Cherian, shared in details from their respective field of expertise. Particularly Dr. Suma made a very impressive talk on curriculum content, development and design in the light of NEP. I'm sure that would have been very, very helpful to all of us who are not in autonomous institutions but affiliated colleges. In fact, I wanted Professor Jeevan Kumar to be there in the morning session to give an overall perspective, but by God's grace, I think he has amalgamated, as Father had put it rightly, every point that has been covered by the resource persons and given us an overall insight into this topic on inclusiveness and diversity from the point of student enrollment, staff selection, curriculum designing, as well as student-centered programs in higher education. I congratulate our organizing team led by Father Carlos, who is the head of the Department of Arts and Humanities, the IQAC coordinator, Professor Sri Lakshmi, the Vice Principal, Father Mervyn, for the effort that they have taken. Within a short period of time, they were able to get as many resource persons as possible. And I would like to thank each of you, dear participants. I'm sure it was such a wonderful experience for each one of you to spend the whole day on a topic which is important and which will be very, very useful in the coming years. Thank you one and all. And my special thanks and warm wishes to Dr. Professor Jeevan Kumar. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I now call upon Mrs. Anna Kumari, the head of the Department of Computer Science, to deliver the oath of thanks.
Let us rise up and be thankful, for if we didn't learn a lot today, at least we learned a little. So let us all be thankful, says Buddha. Greetings to one and all present here. I deem it a great honor and privilege to propose the vote of thanks on this occasion. Let me start by giving glory to the Almighty God for making today's occasion a resounding success. We express heartfelt thanks to our most distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Ponmudi Raj, Advisor and Director of NEP. Thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation in spite of your busy schedule and sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you, sir. I extend my sincere gratitude to our resource person, Dr. Cherian Alexander, former HOD of English, St. Joseph's Autonomous College, Bangalore, for giving us an insight on inclusiveness and diversity in competency building and skill development in pedagogy. I thank Dr. Suma Singh, Dean of Arts, Mount Carmel College Autonomous, Bangalore, for sharing her valuable thoughts in inclusiveness and diversity in curriculum designing and development. My sincere thanks to Dr. Arulmani, HOD of English, St. Joseph's College Autonomous, Bangalore, for sharing your valuable knowledge with us in cultural and ethical consideration in NEP 2020. I extend my gratitude to Dr. Jeevan Kumar, former Chairman and Professor, Department of Political Science, Bangalore University, for enlightening us with his knowledge on inclusiveness and diversity in higher education in the field of NEP 2020. Sincere thanks to Dr. Jeevan Kumar for his active participation throughout the conference. Thank you, sir. It was a pleasure listening to you. We are grateful to our Director, Reverend Father Gilbert Mastinez in absentia, for his continuous support. Thank you, Father. I extend my heartfelt thanks to our beloved Principal, Dr. E. Jerome Xavier, and Vice Principal, Reverend Father Mervyn Frank, who have been a pillar of support in our entire endeavor. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Father. Special thanks to our IQC coordinator, Professor Sri Lakshmi, convener, Professor Reverend Father Carlos Luis, for their meticulous planning in organizing today's conference and making it a great success. I extend my thanks to the technical team, Mr. Ramdas and Ms. Roslin, for live streaming today's program and assisting us with the technicalities of the day. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. I thank Ms. Pratibha, Ms. Shalini, and Ms. Kriti for coordinating the paper presentation session. Thank you all. I extend my sincere thanks to Ms. Beena, Ms. Navita, and Ms. Surya for anchoring today's session. Thank you all. I thank all the participants for taking the time to present and attend today's conference. My sincere thanks to all the participants for making today's event a successful one. Thank you, participants. Sincere sense of gratitude to all the heads of the department and teaching fraternity for your presence and cooperation. I thank all teaching and non-teaching members for your unconditional support and motivation. I thank each and everyone who directly and indirectly contributed your support to the event. Once again, I thank you, one and all present here. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Dear participants, the link for the feedback form will be posted in the chat box. Kindly fill the feedback form before you leave the meeting. And a special thanks to all the dignitaries, participants, and the paper presenters for your enthusiastic participation. Thank you, one and all. Have a great evening ahead. Thank you.
Can we please wait back for group photo? If you don't mind, if you can just turn on your cameras, it will be nice. I request Professor Ramadas to please do the needful, take a photograph, a screenshot or whatever, of all the participants present.